I'm very happy to have a chance to talk with you all, with the 99s, which of course is such an important group in aviation history and American history, I would argue. And you all know the WASP. So many of the WASP were 99s, and so I feel really privileged to have a chance to talk to you about them. So I wanted to share this picture just because we talked about how long I've been doing this, and some of you might know about this air show. I don't think it exists anymore, but I graduated from college in history and had a bachelor's in history and was working at Spartan School of Aeronautics in Tulsa. I was teaching history and government for their associates program. And I went to the Biplane Expo up in Bartlesville, Oklahoma. Great little air show. Went by myself. And at the end, I was peeking in the cockpit of a Pitt Special that had been a part of the air show. And the pilot very generously chatted with me and then pointed over into the corner and said, in the shade of the hangar over there is Curtis Pitts. You should go say hi. And I was feeling very brave and full of my 23-year-old self and marched over and said, Mr. Pitts, you sure make a neat airplane. And he was very nice and chatted with me and then turned and introduced the woman next to him, Carol Bailey Bosca, who had won the 1951 aerobatic championship in his airplane, his second airplane. So we chatted a while, got this photo taken, which, for the younger folks isn't a big deal, but for the rest of us, I was carrying a camera with film when I had this picture taken, and I'm grateful for the stranger that took it so well. And it was after the moment after this photo that I discovered that Carol was a WASP of World War II. And I'd never heard of them, and I couldn't believe it. And she's like, oh yeah, I flew B-26s and AT-6s and whatever you can think of. And I was just stunned. So she gave me her name and address on a little index card that I still have and said, write to me sometime. This is before email and all that. Write to me sometime and if you want to learn more. And so I did. I went to graduate school to learn more about them. And I wrote to Carol in 1996, and that's when I started my oral histories. So I feel very fortunate to have had the chance to do this. It was just a pure chance meeting, but I'm grateful for that little Bartlesville Biplane Expo. So if any of you were associated with that, thank you. You changed my whole life. So I want to talk about the WASP in a little bit different way than I have before. Because you all know who they were, but I want to just kind of go over the basics of them so we have kind of make sure everybody's on the same page. The Women Airforce Service Pilots were all volunteers, as of course every woman who's ever served in the Armed Forces of the United States is. And they served as pilots with the Army Air Forces from 1942 to 1944. 25,000 women applied to this program. They're all coming out of that golden age of aviation. They grew up with Amelia Earhart and Helen Ritchie and Jacqueline Cochran, even watching these prominent women pilots, and the whole world wanted to fly, and women were no exception. 1,830 were selected for training. 1,102 women ended up serving with the Army Air Forces, wearing those wings. The 1,074 who graduated training, and then the 28 who had started as ferry pilots ahead of time. There were they flew 77 types of planes, over 60 million miles within the continental United States. They ferried planes, they test flew repaired aircraft, trained ground and air gunners, flew non-flying personnel. They were the weather ship. They basically did whatever needed to be done, whatever flying the Army Air Forces needed to be done, that's what they did. And I think it's really important to remember that 38 of the women were killed flying for their country. You can see 2 of the women that were killed right in this picture. The second to left in the photo is Cornelia Fort, and sitting next to her is Evelyn Sharp, and they were both among those 38 that were killed. So we've got the kind of big picture of who the WASP were and what they did during the war. But I really want to look at, why do we need to learn about them? They were clearly cool, very, very cool women, but they really can teach us all lessons, I think, in perseverance. And in the times in which we live, these are times, that can be a challenge. And I think the WASP can really teach us something about how to stick to it and get through to the other side through successes and failures. So we're going to go through 10 little examples of lessons in perseverance that the WASP can teach us. The first one is learning to fly, kind of a countdown lessons. Learning to fly, of course, all of the WASP had to be pilots before they came into the Army Air Forces. Men didn't, but the women did. And I think one of my favorite examples is Teresa James. She becomes one of the WAFs, one of the very first 28 women to fly. Teresa was terrified of airplanes. She was a little older than some of the other women, and she was terrified. She had seen an Army plane crash when she was a very young girl. Her own brother had crashed and nearly been killed and been severely injured. So she was very afraid of airplanes. But as Teresa tells it, the airport was where all the cute boys hung out. And so she would go with her brother and hang out at the airport. And there was one boy in particular she really wanted to impress. And when he went away to work for an airline, the other guys all goaded her into, wouldn't it be nice if you learned to fly to impress Bill when he got home? She tells the story of her first flight, about how terrifying it was, her first solo flight. She couldn't figure out the weight difference with the instructor out and was just terrified and swore she'd never get in a plane again. And the guys all kind of goaded her and teased her. And she ended up getting her license. She ended up becoming, you can see in the pictures, the first airmail pilot out of her hometown. She's a stunt pilot and flies air shows across the eastern part of the United States. And then she goes on and gets her instructor's license and instructs pilots all across the East Coast. This is a picture of her with the man who would become her husband, not the boy she tried to impress, who she was pretty over by the time she learned to love flying. But that overcoming that fear and then becoming really good at it, I think is a good lesson. There were other WASP who learned to fly as well. Some of the women, their parents were rich and bought planes, or they had access other ways, but most of the women, that's not the story. Florence Schutze Reynolds, some of you might have known Schutze. Schutze was an example of those WASP who learned to fly in the civilian pilot training program. Over 40% of the WASP learned through this program. And this was a program that the federal government put together to train pilots. They knew they were going to need more pilots. And they let one woman in a class of 10. And Schutze, I think, is an example of, kind of fighting her way into the class, because most of the classes were tied to colleges. She couldn't afford to go to college. They'd been hit hard by the Depression. So she kind of talked her way into the ground school, and the top 2 students in the ground school got to get that flight training. So she made sure she was one of the top 2 students. And then when it came to the flight training, she was too young, but they didn't ask. And so she didn't tell. And she got to go through the flight training, and then because of her flight experience was able to become a WASP. Another way that some WASP learned to fly and became experienced was as, being trained as flight instructors. This is Dot Swain Lewis. If you've seen some of the statues of the WASP across the country, there's one up in Wisconsin, there's one at the College Park Airport. The Air Force Academy has one of Dot's statues, a very talented artist after the war. But she joined Phoebe Omley's training program, of course, famous 99. Phoebe Omley wanted to help prepare for the war effort and trained women pilots. And then she made the deal to serve. She served as a flight instructor for the Navy and then a flight instructor for the WASP, and then joined the WASP when she saw her students flying better planes. But they each found their way that they could be a part of the aviation industry and be a part of serving their country. Fighting to serve. this was another lesson that we learn in Perseverance from the WASP, is the women saw this need to serve. You have Jacqueline Cochran and Nancy Love, who are the two leaders of this WASP program. And they both, as early as 1939, are advocating for the need for women to fly. Jacqueline Cochran is writing to Eleanor Roosevelt just days after Poland had been invaded by Germany in September of 1939. And she's trying to work that political side of, you're going to need women pilots, let's train them, it takes so much time. Nancy Love is working with Robert Olds, and becomes Colonel Robert Olds, and gathering names of qualified women. And then Jackie does the same, works with Olds, works with General Arnold, gathering the names of women, sending telegrams to see who would be interested in flying if women were able to fly. So they kept getting told no, but they were gathering information, they were getting ready. And then they were finally, when that yes came, when in the late summer, early fall of 1942, the Army Air Forces said, okay, we're desperate enough to have this experiment of women pilots. Nancy and Jackie were both ready. They knew where the women were, they knew how to get things started, and they had a plan in place. So being told no, you can still get ready when the opportunity comes, if you know that it's on its way. Another group who was fighting for the chance to serve was a group I call the hopefuls, these women who applied for the training program. Again, 25,000 women applied. I saw the letters, the application letters. For years, I thought Jackie Cochran had made up that number of 25,000, but I've seen them. They're in the National Archives, women from all across the country writing in and saying, please, how do I learn to fly? What can I do? I want to serve my country. I want to be a pilot. It's not fair that just because I'm not a boy, I can't serve in this way. And again, 1,830 were brought into these, what end up being 18 classes of trainees. They spend half their days in ground school, taking math, taking engines, taking Morse code, which they almost universally hated, doing calisthenics so they'd be strong flying these different types of aircraft. And of course, they spend the other half of their day flying. They fly primary trainers, basic, advanced, all the way up to the AT-6. They were in link trainers, the simulators of the day. Everything they needed to do over a course of 6 months, 6 to 7 months of training in the hot Texas sun, first in Houston, then in Sweetwater, not knowing if they'd graduate, not knowing what they would do after they graduated, but knowing that they wanted to fly and they wanted to serve, and sticking with that fight. Now, expanding the experiment, I think, is one of my favorite lessons that the WASP give us. So when the WAF started, right, the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron, they started at the same time as the trainees. And I think this is, for this group especially, it's important to recognize that they were always one group. They get the unifying name of the Women Airforce Service Pilots, the WASP, in the summer of '43, but they start in the fall of '42. The Army Air Forces didn't want two separate women's programs, so they have the ferry pilots that are called the WAFs, and then the trainees under Jackie, when they graduate from training, they go straight into the WAFs and they become WAFs. So you have some that wore that gray-green uniform of the WASP. I know a lot of you knew Margaret Ringenberg. She was in the 3rd class of trainees. And she talked about that when she graduated, she went to Wilmington, where the WAFs were flying for the Ferrying Command, and wore that gray-green uniform of the WAFs. So it's really important, I think, to recognize it was always one program, just 2 different phases of that program. But when they first started, when those ferry pilots started flying for the Army Air Forces, they had high expectations. They had to have 250 flight time. They had to have a 200 horsepower rating. The first 10 women had over 1,000 hours average flight time. So they're really highly experienced, highly qualified pilots. And they were completely limited in what they were able to fly. They were in PT-19s, they were flying Cubs, they were flying Taylor crafts, they were flying all these really light 65 horsepower aircraft, because the Army Air Forces just wasn't sure if women could do this, you know, whether they could be trusted to fly this. And this expanding the experiment, and the Army Air Forces did call it an experiment in the cockpit, you know, of whether women could fly or not, whether women could fly these military planes. Not all the WASP liked it when I called it that, but it's in all the documents that this was an experiment. So the women knew that they had to prove themselves, that they had to prove that they could be good pilots, they could be dependable. But at the same time, they wanted to push ahead and expand what they were able to do. So you see a lot of this from Nancy Love, who goes and visits different potential bases, the 5th Varying Group, and pushes into which planes she gets to fly. Okay, Nancy's there. Oh, I want to fly an AT-6. Okay, Nancy, we'll let you fly an AT-6. Okay, now I've flown it. I've proven women can do it. Now you need to let all the other girls do it. Then she goes out to California and gets in a P-51. Now I've proved girls can fly P-51s, and they start to let the other women do it. So they just push their way into those more advanced aircraft until pretty soon those ferry pilots, and again, about 300 of the women flew for the ferry command. You've got the ferry pilots flying everything from P-38s to, there's Teresa James, the girl who was afraid to fly, flying a P-40 Jug, right, the Thunderbolt, which she flew, you know, 1,000 hours almost during the war. So they get this push into these planes, and they have to prove that they can do it, but they keep pushing that limit, pushing that envelope, if you will, of the limits that the Army Air Force is putting on them, and gaining that trust through their actions. Right. And then they expand the experiment even more. You know, the Army Air Forces in the summer of '43 starts asking, well, what else can they do? And this is where Jackie Cochran really leaps on this opportunity. Her vision for the women pilots had always been much bigger than just ferrying, where Nancy and her kind of allies really thought ferrying was the job for the women. Jackie thought women could do more and really wanted them to take over all the domestic flying. Jackie actually called it aerial dishwashing, right? The women will be aerial dishwashers. We'll do all the flying that has to be done that nobody really wants to do. It's not glamorous, but the dishes must be done. And that's what women do. And so that's kind of the tone Jackie took in promoting this. So they expanded what women did. This is at Camp Davis, North Carolina. This is Dora Struther, who we'll see again throughout, but some of you might have known Dora. And they had them towing targets behind aircraft, because you've got to train men on the ground and men in other planes how to shoot at a moving aircraft. So they would tow targets behind the planes and have live ammunition fired upon them. And this was one of the first jobs. This is something women can do. They can fly at a prescribed altitude, at a prescribed speed, at a prescribed path, and they can do that well. Other things that they did, they flew remote control aircraft. These were PQ-8s. These were top secret airplanes. This is Lois Ziller, if any of you knew her from West Texas, did these top secret jobs. They flew bombers. They flew B-17s, B-26s, DC-3s. They flew all these different aircraft. These women, I show this picture just because it's so well known, but these women were trained as first pilots in the B-17. There were 13 of them initially that were trained in this. And they towed targets behind it and trained the gunners that were on the aircraft. But then the women also did things that were, well known at the time, but they were flight instructors. This is Ethel Meyer Finley, who was a flight instructor out at Shaw Field. And this was actually incredibly controversial because they wondered if men could stand learning how to fly an airplane from a woman. The counter argument, of course, was women teach men how to walk. We can teach them how to fly. And so you have some women doing this, just about any job that needed to be done, right? And I would argue they saw themselves also as serving a purpose. This is Dora here, Dora Dougherty Strother McCown, and this is Dee Dee Mormon. This is Paul Tibbets, who goes on to fly the Enola Gay against Hiroshima. And this is the B-29. Some of you probably know the story. When it was first designed, the cowlings were too tight. They had some engine fires that tragically killed the test pilots, and nobody would fly it. Tibbets tapped Dora and Dee Dee to learn to fly this plane and then demonstrate it to the men to show it was so easy to fly, even a girl could do it. This was a big joke to him because he knew these women were great pilots, but wanted to show the men that they could do it. And Dora and Dee Dee both, and Tibbets all talked about the fact that, you know, this was a mission. This was an important plane for the war, and so they were really doing a service to their country by learning to fly this. And of course, Dora was very proud of that, you know, 12,000 horsepower rating that she carried around on her license from then on.